going to go ahead and use our pry tool. Get in right behind the cap here. Gently pry away and remove your center cap. Using a 19mm socket, go ahead, loosen and remove the lug nuts. Go ahead and grab your wheel and set it aside. Now we're using a number 10 Allen wrench or Allen tool on the back side here to remove this slider pin. Then once that comes out, we're going to go up to the top portion and remove this slider pin as well. Using our number 10 Allen, we're going to go ahead and loosen these here. And once we get these loose, we can then go ahead and remove them completely. Ours has a significant amount of rust on the pin, so you just want to work that back and forth. So you can go ahead and pop that out. I'm going to go ahead and do the same for the top pin. Loosen that up and work that out. We're going to use a small pry bar and we're going to work this brake caliper up and off. Once you get your brake caliper up and off, you can use your tool here to go ahead and support and hang that caliper so you don't have any extra tension on this hose. Use a pry bar or some sort of pry tool to get behind the lip of this cap right here. I'm going to go ahead and tap this and get that cap off. Once it starts to come off, just work your way around the perimeter. And then we're going to go ahead and pop that cap off. You use a pair of cutters here. Grab that cotter pin and remove that cotter pin. Once that pin is out, next we want to go ahead and remove our spindle nut. Take that nut off. I put it right inside the cap that popped off. Next, taking your two palms, we're gently going to bump the rotor and it's going to eject the washer and probably the bearing. Nice and easy. You're going to get a washer and you're going to get a bearing. Grab that rotor, slide that off. Now we have our spindle here. Let's go ahead and clean this up. What we're going to do is inspect our spindle here to see if there's any score marks or any types of damage. Everything's nice and clean. Just give that a wipe down. And on the back side of a rotor here, we have a bearing in the back that is very similar to our front bearing, it's just larger. There is a seal here that is holding that bearing in place. What we're going to do is flip the rotor over and use our brass punch to work that bearing out as well as that seal. We're going to set our rotor up on a couple blocks right here. This is going to allow our bearing and seal to pop out through the bottom. We're going to put our punch down inside. Our bearing popped out, so we'll just set that aside. We also have to get the seal out that is in there. We now have the seal out. Now on the inside of our brake rotor is what we call a race. It's a conical base for our bearing to fit into and spin on. We're going to continue to use our punch coming through on the other side and hitting this race, working our way around and popping this out of the brake rotor. Now we're able to get our race tapped out. We're going to flip this over and we're going to do the same for the front now. We're able to tap out our front race. I'm going to go ahead and clean up the inside of our brake rotor, front and back. Once you have your rotor all cleaned up on the inside and you're ready for that new race, we're just going to put a thin coat of grease on the inside. Then we're going to take our bearing race, and if you want, you can put a little bit of grease around the perimeter of this as well. It's not going to harm any, but it's not necessary. Go ahead and line this up. We're now going to use a drive tool to line this up. And this drive tool sits right around the outer perimeter of this here, and we're going to push this down inside our brake rotor. And not only here, but you'll feel it bottom out. You can look on the inside and see the ridge that it's sitting on. Now on the back side of the rotor, we're going to do the same. A little bit of grease. And take our race, make sure that the cone side is facing outward. You do not want to tap this in backwards. Hear a clear, distinctive sound that that race has now bottomed out. Now when packing bearings, you have a couple different options. You can go ahead and take the bearing itself, and you're going to grab some high temperature bearing grease. And you put it in your palm of your hand like this. Hopefully you're going to be wearing gloves. It's a pretty sloppy job. You're going to take your bearing like this here, and basically what you're going to do is cup and scoop, cup and scoop. And what we're doing is it forces the grease into the bottom side, pushes it through the roller bearing and out through the top. So as you're doing this here, you're going to watch for the grease to come out through the top of the bearing and then rotate it a little bit. And you're going to continue to work around, forcing that grease up and through. Continue to work it around. That is your first option you can do. You can see the grease coming out. You know that that grease is all the way through the rollers and up through the top. Continue to do that, then you can pop that grease out that's in the middle, put that back in your glove, and you can work around. And then you can flip it if you want. Just work that grease in and around. That bearing itself is fully packed, so you can set that aside. Now if you have a bearing packing tool here like we have, we put fresh grease in the bottom. We have our dish here. I'm going to go ahead and put our bearing into this. I'm going to go ahead and press this down. As you press this down, it is forcing the grease up through the bearing itself and out, basically doing the same thing we just did in the palm of our hand. Then we have the grease pushed through. The grease is coming out through the whole top side. Then we take some of the residual grease here, just rub that around and into the face of the bearings. There you have it. Our next step is to go ahead and pre-pack the inside of our brake rotor / hub unit itself. You want to take your high temperature bearing grease and basically you want to pack it inside of the hub itself. I'm going to put this through the front and the back. Now we're not going to fill the entire unit, but what we want to do is make sure that the inside of the bearing race itself, going through to the other bearing race, you want to make sure that the grease itself is almost level with that all the way around. So you pack that in and around there. And if you have excess grease like that, go ahead and just put that back in your container. Now on the back side here, we're going to go ahead and install our large bearing, cone side down. Just going to put a little bit of grease inside that. Now we have our back seal that sets in like so. Now we're going to use our seal tool here to go ahead and get our seal mounted here. Now that our seal is mounted and nice and flush, just going to wipe up the outside. Now on the inside lip right here, we have a little bit of rust buildup. We're going to use a super fine sandpaper just to clean off some of the rust that's in here, because this is where our seal from the backside of our brake rotor is going to be riding on. So we just want to knock off any of the chunks of rust that are on there so it doesn't tear up that seal. We're just going to run this back and forth like so. Once that looks good, we're going to give it a quick spray and clean that up. I'm going to go ahead and put a light coat of grease on our spindle here. And once we have that grease on there, go ahead and take your brake rotor. I'm going to slide this in. Take your front outer bearing, slide that in. I'll sometimes take a little bit of grease just to put on top of the bearing like so. Next, you want to take your washer, line that up, and take your castle nut and spin that on. So what we're going to do now is we're going to use our wrench, and we're going to snug down the outer castle nut just a little bit as we rotate the wheel. We're going to do this to seat the bearings, the inner and outer bearings, so that it supports the rotor properly. Now at this point here, we're able to snug up the bearings. It did pop into place. And what you want to do is make sure that the rotor itself does spin nice and free. Also at this point here, we're going to make sure that our notch and our castle nut lines up with the hole in our spindle. Once that's all set, we're going to go ahead and put a new cotter pin in. And just kind of wiggle this around a little bit. Pop that cotter pin in. And go ahead and bend our tab up. Bend that over, and we're just going to cut off the excess off the bottom here. Now we can go ahead and install our dust cap. Now we're going to use a rubber mallet here. You don't want to use a regular hammer on the cap because you'll smash it in, and that might cause some issues. Go ahead and get that cap on there. Make sure it's sealed all the way around. You're all set. Now we'll go ahead and remove our tool. Slide our pads over the rotor. Now I went ahead and cleaned up our slider pins right here. We ran them through the wire wheel. You could use a wire brush, and I put some anti-seize compound on there. I want to go ahead and line that pin up. And we'll get that threaded in a couple threads, and we'll repeat for the bottom. I'm going to go ahead, we're going to use our Allen wrench, and we're going to tighten up the slider pins here. Once we get our bottom one snug, we'll go ahead and tighten up the top one. I want to make sure these are nice and tight. Double check the bottom one here. Now that we're completed, go ahead and install your wheel. Go ahead and pump up the brakes, open up the hood, and check your brake fluid. Top off as necessary. Let's go ahead and install our wheel. I'm going to get all of our lug nuts started by hand first. Once we get these on, we'll go ahead and snug them down. I'm going to go ahead and torque these down to 95 foot-pounds. Once you have your lug nuts torqued down, go ahead and install your center cap, lining up these little plastic stud ears with the nuts here.